What if I told you that for 31 years, a killer walked free in plain sight, trusted by an entire community, while his victim lay buried beneath the very foundation of his business empire? This is the story of Sarah Beth Morrison, a story that will make you question everyone you think you know. The fluorescent lights in the main office of Millbrook Elementary hummed their familiar tune as Principal Janet Williams checked her watch for the third time in 5 minutes. 7:15 a.m. The hallways echoed with the sounds of custodians pushing wheeled buckets and the distant rumble of school buses pulling into the circular drive. Sarah Beth Morrison's classroom remained dark. Janet lifted the black telephone receiver, her fingers already knowing the sequence of numbers by heart. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times before the answering machine clicked on. Sarah Beth's cheerful voice filled the receiver. "Hi, you've reached Sarah Beth. I can't come to the phone right now, but leave me a message and I'll get back to you as soon as I can." The principal hung up without leaving another message. She had already called twice since 6:45 a.m. 22 years of working in education had taught Janet to trust her instincts, and something felt wrong. Sarah Beth had never missed a day without calling. Not once in the year and a half since she'd returned from Southern Illinois University with her teaching degree and that infectious smile that could calm even the most restless third grader. The morning bell would ring in exactly 30 minutes. Janet grabbed her keys from the desk drawer and headed for the parking lot. The December air bit at her cheeks as she walked toward her sedan, frost still clinging to the windshields of cars in the staff parking area. Millbrook's main street stretched before her, a collection of brick storefronts and family businesses that had anchored this farming community for generations. For 12, Elm Street sat 3 blocks from the school, a modest white rental house with green shutters that Sarah Beth had chosen specifically for its walking distance to work. "I want to be close enough to run back if I forget something," she had told Janet during the interview process, laughing as she described her tendency to leave important papers at home. Janet pulled into the driveway behind Sarah Beth's red Honda Civic. The car sat exactly where it always did, positioned carefully to avoid the oil stain near the garage door. No snow had accumulated on the windshield, suggesting it hadn't moved since the previous evening. The front door was locked. Janet knocked softly at first, then more firmly. "Sarah Beth? It's Janet from school." She pressed her ear to the wood, but heard nothing from inside. Moving to the kitchen window, Janet cupped her hands against the glass and peered inside. The scene that greeted her made her stomach tighten. A bowl of cereal sat on the small dining table, milk still pooled around scattered Cheerios. A coffee mug rested nearby, and Janet could see the faint wisp of steam still rising from its contents. Sarah Beth's brown leather purse sat on the kitchen counter, car keys beside it. Everything appeared normal, yet completely wrong. Janet returned to her car and used the radio to call the school secretary. Within 20 minutes, word had spread through Millbrook's tight-knit network of parents and community members. By 8:30 a.m., a small crowd had gathered in the elementary school parking lot. "She was just here Saturday for the winter concert rehearsal," said Margaret Shun, whose daughter Emma was in Sarah Beth's class. "She stayed after to help set up chairs for the performance. Said she was excited about the kids singing Silent Night in harmony." Tom Rodriguez, whose son Miguel struggled with reading until Sarah Beth worked with him one-on-one every Tuesday after school, shook his head. "This doesn't make sense. She was supposed to call me last night about Miguel's progress report. She never forgets things like that." The parents spoke in hushed tones, sharing memories that painted the same picture. Sarah Beth Morrison was the teacher every parent hoped their child would have. Fresh out of college, but mature beyond her years, she treated each student as if they were her own. She knew their siblings' names, remembered their birthday parties, and called home not just when there were problems, but when there were celebrations. "She grew up here," said Patricia Williams, whose twin boys were in Sarah Beth's class. "We all watched her graduate from Millbrook High, go off to college, and come back to teach our children. She's one of us." The crowd grew larger as the morning progressed. Parents who should have been at work lingered in the parking lot, unwilling to leave until someone could explain where their children's beloved teacher had gone. At 9:45 a.m., a dark blue pickup truck pulled into the school parking lot. Frank Kowalski stepped out, his work boots crunching on the frost-covered asphalt. At 42, he carried himself with the confidence of a man who had built a successful business from nothing. His auto repair shop employed half the young men in town, and his generosity toward local sports teams and church fundraisers had earned him a reputation as one of Millbrook's most civic-minded citizens. "What's going on here?" he asked Janet, though his tone suggested he already knew. "Sarah Beth didn't show up for work," Janet explained. "We went to her house. Her car's there, but she's not answering the door." Frank's face shifted through what appeared to be surprise, concern, and determination in rapid succession. "Have you called the police?" "I was waiting to see if maybe she was just sick and sleeping deeply, but—" "No," Frank interrupted, pulling a cell phone from his jacket pocket. "This isn't like her. Something's wrong." Within minutes, Frank had organized the gathering crowd into search teams. He assigned groups to check the local diner, the library, the small park where Sarah Beth sometimes jogged. His take-charge attitude seemed to comfort the worried parents, and soon he was directing the search with the efficiency of someone accustomed to solving problems. "Linda's driving in from the clinic," he told Janet, referring to his wife and Sarah Beth's mother. "She's going to check with Sarah Beth's college friends, see if maybe she went to visit someone and forgot to mention it." The volunteer search continued through the afternoon, but it yielded nothing. Sarah Beth Morrison had simply vanished, leaving behind a half-eaten breakfast, a warm cup of coffee, and a community that couldn't understand how someone so central to their daily lives could disappear without explanation. As evening approached, Frank stood in the elementary school parking lot with his arm around Linda's shoulders. She leaned into him, her nurse's uniform wrinkled from the day's frantic searching, tears streaming down her face. "We'll find her," Frank murmured into his wife's hair. "I promise you, we'll find her." But as he spoke these words of comfort, his hands remained perfectly steady on Linda's shoulders. Not the trembling touch of a frightened stepfather, but the controlled grip of a man who seemed unusually calm for someone whose family had just been shattered by an inexplicable disappearance. Those hands had no reason to shake. After all, Frank Kowalski knew exactly where Sarah Beth Morrison was. For years earlier, September 1985, 16-year-old Sarah Beth Morrison sat on the front porch steps, watching her mother pace the gravel driveway while talking to the man underneath their broken-down Buick. Linda had been a single mother for 3 years, ever since Sarah Beth's father died in a farming accident, and the weight of managing everything alone showed in the tired lines around her eyes. "The transmission's shot," Frank Kowalski said, sliding out from beneath the car and wiping his hands on a blue shop rag. "But I can rebuild it for you. Won't cost near what the dealership would charge." Sarah Beth studied this stranger who had appeared at their doorstep after her mother's car had broken down outside his garage. Frank was younger than most of the men her mother knew, maybe early 30s, with dark hair and an easy smile that seemed to put Linda at ease for the first time in months. "I don't know," Linda said, wrapping her cardigan tighter around her shoulders. "Money's been tight since I started working at the clinic part-time." Frank stood and brushed the dirt from his knees. "Tell you what, pay me when you can. I know what it's like to struggle. Built my business from nothing, and folks in this town helped me when I needed it most." Sarah Beth watched her mother's posture change, shoulders relaxing as Frank spoke. "When was the last time anyone had offered to help without expecting something in return?" "That's very kind," Linda said. "Are you sure?" "Neighbors help neighbors," Frank replied. "That's how small towns work." Over the following months, Frank became a regular presence at 412 Elm Street. He fixed their leaky faucet, replaced broken fence posts, and always seemed to appear when something needed repair. Sarah Beth noticed how her mother started wearing lipstick again, how she'd change out of her work clothes before Frank arrived. When Frank proposed to Linda in the spring of 1986, Sarah Beth felt genuinely happy for her mother. Frank had kept his promises. He had fixed the things that were broken in their lives. Present day, December 13, 1989. Detective Mike Patterson arrived in Millbrook at 7 a.m., exactly 24 hours after Sarah Beth Morrison's disappearance. At 45, Patterson had worked missing persons cases across 3 counties, and experience had taught him that the first 48 hours determined whether someone came home alive. The Illinois State Police had assigned him to the case after Millbrook's single officer, Deputy Rick Hansen, requested assistance. Hansen was competent enough for traffic violations and domestic disputes, but a missing person investigation required resources the town couldn't provide. Patterson's first stop was Kowalski's Auto Repair, where Frank had agreed to meet him before the shop opened for business. The garage sat on the outskirts of town, a sprawling complex of service bays and outbuildings that suggested business was good. "Coffee?" Frank asked, leading Patterson into a small office that smelled of motor oil and coffee grounds. "I've got a fresh pot." Patterson accepted the cup and pulled out his notebook. "Tell me about Sarah Beth. When did you last see her?" "Sunday dinner," Frank said without hesitation. "Linda always cooks on Sundays." Sarah Beth came by around 5, stayed until maybe 8:30. Seemed normal, talked about her student's Christmas concert. "How would you describe your relationship with your stepdaughter?" Frank leaned back in his chair, considering the question. "Good. Took some time when Linda and I first got married. She was 16. You know how teenagers can be about change. But we found our rhythm. She's a special kid. Woman, I should say. Hard to believe she's 22 now." Patterson made notes, observing Frank's body language. The man appeared genuinely concerned, cooperative, willing to answer any question. Yet something felt rehearsed about his responses, as if he'd anticipated this conversation. "Any problems lately? Boyfriend troubles, financial stress, conflicts at work?" "Nothing like that. Sarah Beth loved teaching, loved those kids. Never heard her complain about money or men." Frank paused, seeming to consider something. Though she had been asking questions about business lately. "What kind of questions?" "Oh, you know, how to read financial statements, understand tax records." Said she was thinking about starting a tutoring business on the side, wanted to understand the paperwork side of things. Patterson filed this information away. "I'd like to talk to some of your customers, get a sense of who might have seen her around town recently." Frank's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. "Of course. Though most of my regular customers are local folks you've probably already met. I do get some clients from out of town, traveling salesmen, truckers passing through on Route 51. Hard to track those down." After leaving the garage, Patterson spent the morning conducting interviews throughout Millbrook. The picture that emerged of Frank Kowalski was remarkably consistent. Successful businessman, community leader, devoted husband and stepfather. "Frank sponsored our Little League team for 3 straight years," said Tom Rodriguez. "Bought uniforms, paid for the team banquet. Never asked for anything in return." Margaret Chin nodded enthusiastically. "He volunteers at the church fundraisers, helps set up tables, and clean afterward. My husband says Frank's garage is the most honest repair shop he's ever dealt with." But as Patterson dug deeper, subtle inconsistencies began to emerge. "Frank keeps odd hours sometimes," mentioned elderly Mrs. Henderson, who lived across from the garage. "I see lights on late at night, cars coming and going." Figured it was emergency repairs, but seemed like a lot of emergencies. Deputy Hansen pulled Patterson aside after lunch. "Look, I like Frank well enough, but there's always been talk. Nothing concrete, just talk." "What kind of talk?" "Money. Frank's garage does well, but maybe too well for a town this size. And some of his customers," Hansen shrugged. "They don't look like they're from around here. City types, expensive cars, pay in cash." That afternoon, Patterson returned to Sarah Beth's house for a more thorough examination. Linda Morrison met him at the door, her face pale from a sleepless night of waiting for news. "Detective Patterson, this is my husband Frank," she said, though they had already met that morning. Frank extended his hand. "Anything we can do to help?" Patterson studied Linda's face as she watched her husband. The strain was evident. Dark circles under her eyes, trembling hands, the desperate hope of a mother clinging to the possibility that her daughter might still come home. But there was something else there too, something that looked almost like doubt. "I'd like to go through the house one more time," Patterson said. "Sometimes a fresh perspective reveals details we missed initially." The three of them moved through the small rental home methodically. Patterson examined the bedroom, bathroom, kitchen, living room. Everything appeared normal, yet something bothered him about the overall scene. In the bedroom, Patterson knelt beside the bed and looked underneath. Clean. He checked the dresser drawers, clothes folded neatly, nothing out of place. The closet revealed a modest wardrobe organized by color and season. too organized. Patterson had been in enough homes to recognize the difference between someone who was naturally tidy and someone whose space had been carefully arranged. Sarah Beth's house felt like the latter. How many of us ignore red flags because someone seems so helpful, so normal? Mrs. Henderson saw Frank's suspicious activities for years, but stayed silent. If you think speaking up about concerning behavior could save lives, hit that like button. Subscribe because Sarah Beth paid the ultimate price for everyone's silence, and her hidden evidence will shock you. Did Sarah Beth always keep things this neat? He asked Linda. She was organized, but not obsessive about it. She'd leave papers scattered on her desk when she was grading, books stacked on the coffee table. Linda looked around the living room. Actually, now that you mention it, it does seem unusually tidy. Frank cleared his throat. Maybe she cleaned up Sunday night after dinner. Some people clean when they're stressed. Patterson made a note. Was she stressed about something? No more than usual. Just the normal teacher stuff, lesson plans, parent conferences coming up. But as Patterson continued his examination, the feeling of wrongness intensified. The desk in the living room showed no papers, no lesson plans, no evidence of the work Linda described. The coffee table held only a single magazine, perfectly aligned with the table's edge. Someone had been here after Sarah Beth disappeared. Someone who knew exactly what to remove and what to leave behind. Someone who wanted this house to tell a very specific story. Patterson closed his notebook and looked at Linda and Frank standing together in the doorway. I'll need a list of everyone who has a key to this house. Just Sarah Beth and me, Linda replied quickly. Anyone else? Landlord, maintenance person, close friends? Linda shook her head, but Patterson noticed Frank's slight hesitation before he also denied having access. As they prepared to leave, Patterson took one final look around the pristine living room. Whoever had cleaned this house was methodical, careful, and familiar enough with Sarah Beth's habits to know exactly how to make everything appear normal. The question was, had they been careful enough to avoid leaving any trace of themselves behind? Detective Patterson returned to his motel room that evening with a stack of financial documents Deputy Hansen had helped him gather from the county clerk's office. In 1989, investigations moved at the speed of paper trails and phone calls, each lead requiring physical legwork that consumed precious hours. He spread the records across the small table under the lamplight. Kowalski's Auto Repair had been incorporated in 1982, 3 years before Frank married Linda. The business showed steady growth, perhaps too steady for a small-town garage competing with 2 other repair shops in the area. The tax filings painted an interesting picture. Frank reported income from automotive repairs, but also listed consulting services and equipment sales as revenue sources. Patterson had seen enough criminal enterprises to recognize the pattern. Legitimate business activities providing cover for something else entirely. The next morning, Patterson visited Millbrook's only bank, First National, where Frank maintained both personal and business accounts. Bank President Robert Hayes, a nervous man in his 50s, led Patterson into a small conference room. I can't show you account details without a warrant, Hayes explained, adjusting his tie. But I can tell you Frank's been a customer since 1982. Never had any problems with him. What about the nature of his deposits? Large cash transactions, unusual patterns. Hayes shifted uncomfortably. Frank's business generates a lot of cash. People pay for car repairs in cash, especially the farmers during harvest season. Patterson nodded, making notes. Any customers you didn't recognize? Out-of-town business. Some. Frank mentioned he'd started doing specialty work, engine rebuilds for collectors, custom modifications. That kind of work draws customers from Chicago, Milwaukee, other cities. After leaving the bank, Patterson drove to the garage. Frank wasn't there, but his office remained unlocked. The detective examined the customer files, noting the unusual number of luxury vehicles listed for service: Mercedes, BMWs, Cadillacs. Expensive cars for a farming community. Many files showed payments in cash amounts that seemed excessive for routine maintenance. A 1987 BMW sedan had generated $15,000 in custom modifications over 6 months. The work orders were vague: engine work, electrical system upgrades, interior modifications. Mrs. Henderson lived in a farmhouse directly across from the garage, her kitchen window providing a clear view of Frank's operation. Patterson found her hanging laundry on a line behind her house, despite the December chill. Don't mind me asking, but what exactly have you observed about Mr. Kowalski's late-night activities? She glanced toward the garage, then back at Patterson. I'm up early most mornings, farmer's habit, even though we sold our land years ago. Frank gets visitors at odd hours. Well-dressed men in expensive cars, usually late evening or very early morning. How often? Maybe once or twice a month. They don't stay long, maybe 20 minutes. But they always leave with different cars than they arrived in. Patterson felt the familiar tingle that came with a significant lead. Different cars? Frank has maybe 6 or 8 vehicles parked behind the garage at any time. Says they're waiting for parts or customer pickup. But I've seen the same cars sitting there for months. Then suddenly different ones appear. The detective made careful notes. Car swaps, cash transactions, out-of-town customers. The pattern suggested Kowalski's garage served as more than an automotive repair shop. Have you mentioned this to anyone else? Mrs. Henderson's expression darkened. I mentioned it to my daughter once. She told me to mind my own business, said Frank employs half the young men in town, and I shouldn't spread rumors. She paused, hanging a towel with more force than necessary. But that girl's disappearance changes things. If Frank's mixed up in something dangerous. That afternoon, Patterson visited Millbrook Elementary to interview Sarah Beth's colleagues. The faculty lounge smelled of coffee and mimeograph ink. 5 teachers gathered around a circular table, sharing their concerns. Sarah Beth seemed different these past few weeks, said Carol Stevens, the second-grade teacher. Distracted during faculty meetings, not her usual cheerful self. Fourth-grade teacher Jim Morrison, no relation to Sarah Beth, nodded. She asked me some strange questions about business ethics. Said she was curious about how people justify questionable decisions for financial gain. What kind of questions specifically? She wondered about whistleblowing. What someone should do if they discovered illegal activities in their family or workplace. I thought she was developing a social studies lesson about civic responsibility. Principal Janet Williams joined the conversation. Sarah Beth also asked about continuing education opportunities in accounting or business administration. Said she wanted to understand financial statements better. Patterson felt pieces clicking into place. Did she mention why she needed these skills? She said she might need to help her family with some business decisions, Carol replied. But she seemed worried about it, not excited like you'd expect if someone was getting involved in a family business. The teachers exchanged glances, clearly realizing their casual observations might have deeper significance. There was something else, Jim added reluctantly. Last Friday after school, I saw her in her car in the parking lot, just sitting there crying. When I knocked on her window to check on her, she quickly wiped her eyes and said she was fine. But she wasn't fine. She looked scared. That evening, Patterson sat with Linda Morrison in her kitchen, the same space where Sarah Beth had eaten her last family meal 3 days earlier. Linda poured coffee with shaking hands, her wedding ring catching the overhead light. Tell me about last Sunday's dinner, Patterson said gently. Linda closed her eyes, as if replaying the scene. Sarah Beth arrived around 5, like always. But she seemed nervous, kept checking her watch. I asked if she had somewhere else to be, and she said no, just tired from grading papers. How did she interact with Frank? That's what bothers me now, looking back. She barely looked at him during dinner. Usually they talk about her students, her plans for the week. Sunday she just picked at her food and answered in short sentences. Linda stood and moved to the kitchen counter, running her finger along the edge where Frank used to sit his coffee cup during their morning conversations. Frank tried to engage her in conversation about the garage's business. He mentioned wanting to expand, maybe hire another mechanic. Sarah Beth asked pointed questions about his finances, how much money the garage generated, where his customers came from, whether he kept proper records. How did Frank respond? He seemed surprised by her interest, said she'd never cared about business matters before. Then Sarah Beth said something that made the whole room feel cold. Linda turned back to Patterson. She said, I care about making sure everything in our family is legal and ethical. Don't you think that's important, Frank? Patterson leaned forward. What was Frank's reaction? He got very still. You know how some people get loud when they're angry? Frank gets quiet. He just stared at Sarah Beth for the longest time, then said, "Of course. Family loyalty is everything." But the way he said it, Linda shivered. It didn't sound like agreement. It sounded like a warning. The interview was interrupted by a knock at the front door. Patterson opened it to find a young man in work clothes, maybe 19 years old, shifting nervously from foot to foot. "Detective Patterson? I'm Tommy Brennan. I used to work at Frank's garage." The young man's voice trembled. "I need to tell you something about Monday morning, the day after Sarah Beth disappeared." Patterson stepped outside, closing the door behind him to give Linda privacy. "I got to work early Monday, around 6 a.m., Tommy continued. Frank was already there, which was weird because he usually doesn't come in until 7:30. He was feeding something into the shop's furnace. Papers, looked like. Maybe photographs. When he saw me, he got real angry, told me to mind my own business and never mention what I'd seen." The young man looked toward the garage in the distance, then back at Patterson. "I wouldn't have thought much about it, except he fired me that same afternoon. Said business was slow and he had to cut back." But that wasn't true. Frank had more work than he could handle. Patterson felt the case shifting beneath his feet. Whatever Frank had burned that Monday morning, it was important enough to cost a loyal employee his job. Important enough to destroy evidence. The question was, what had Frank been so desperate to hide? Tommy Brennan's revelation about Frank burning documents haunted Patterson through a sleepless night at the Millbrook Motor Lodge. By dawn, the detective had convinced himself that Sarah Beth's house held secrets he had missed during his previous 4 searches. Patterson arrived at 412 Elm Street as morning light filtered through the bare December trees. Using his flashlight even in daylight, he examined every corner with fresh eyes, paying attention to details that might have seemed insignificant before. The living room revealed nothing new. Kitchen cabinets held the usual collection of dishes and food items. The bathroom medicine cabinet contained only basic toiletries and over-the-counter medications. But in the bedroom, something caught his attention. The hardwood floor near Sarah Beth's closet showed subtle variations in the wood grain. One board appeared slightly different from the others, newer, perhaps, or replaced at some point. Patterson knelt and pressed along its edges. The board shifted. Using his pocket knife, Patterson carefully pried up the loose floorboard. Beneath lay a shallow space that someone had deliberately created between the floor joists. Inside, wrapped in a plastic grocery bag, sat a manila envelope. Patterson's pulse quickened as he lifted the package. The envelope was thick, heavy with contents that felt like photographs and papers. Sarah Beth's name was written across the front in her own handwriting, along with a date, November 15, 1989, nearly a month before her disappearance. He carried the envelope to the kitchen table and carefully opened it. The photographs spilled across the table in black and white clarity. Sarah Beth had been methodical in her documentation, using a telephoto lens to capture images from a distance. Each photo was dated and labeled in her neat teacher's handwriting. The first series showed Frank's garage at night, expensive cars parked behind the building. Men in expensive suits stood beside Frank, exchanging briefcases and thick envelopes. Even in the grainy evening light, Patterson recognized faces from FBI wanted posters he'd seen during his career. Vincent "Vinny" Torino, a Chicago mob lieutenant known for running money laundering operations throughout the Midwest. Anthony Calabrese, whose legitimate trucking business was suspected of moving more than commercial cargo. These weren't small-time criminals. They were major players in organized crime. One photograph particularly captured Patterson's attention. Frank stood beside a black Cadillac, shaking hands with a man whose face was partially obscured by shadows. But the license plate was clearly visible, and Sarah Beth had noted both the plate number and the date, October 3, 1989. The images told a story of systematic criminal activity. Cars arriving at night, their license plates documented. Money changing hands in amounts that no legitimate auto repair business would generate. Frank's garage wasn't just fixing engines. It was washing money for the Chicago outfit. But the most chilling aspect was the progression of dates. Sarah Beth had been conducting surveillance for months, building a comprehensive case against her stepfather's criminal enterprise. The handwritten notes revealed Sarah Beth's growing awareness and mounting fear. Her teacher's training in research and documentation had served her well, but her investigation had led her into dangerous territory. September 8, 1989, Frank received $50,000 cash from V. Torino for engine work on a car that was never seen again. The paperwork shows the vehicle was sold to a buyer in Nevada, but the sale price doesn't match the work Frank claims to have performed. September 22, 1989, overheard Frank on phone discussing cleaning money from restaurant receipts. He mentioned needing to show legitimate income sources for tax purposes. October 15, 1989, followed Frank to meeting at grain elevator outside town. He transferred 3 cars to men from Chicago, received briefcase in return. License plates documented. The notes showed Sarah Beth's analytical mind working through the implications of what she'd discovered. She had cross-referenced bank deposit dates with her photographic evidence, creating a timeline that would have impressed federal investigators. But her emotional struggle was evident in later entries. October 28, 1989, I don't know what to do. If I report this, Frank goes to prison and Mom loses everything. But these people are dangerous. What if they hurt someone? What if they hurt Mom? November 3, 1989. Frank keeps asking why I'm working late at school so often. I think he's getting suspicious of my schedule. Need to be more careful. Before we reveal what investigators found next, I need to ask, have you ever suspected someone close to you is hiding something dark? The comments section is filled with viewers sharing their own experiences with family secrets. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button because this case is about to take a turn that nobody saw coming. The last entry, dated December 8, 1989, just 4 days before Sarah Beth's disappearance, sent chills through Patterson's body. Frank knows I found out. I don't know what to do. If something happens to me, look at the garage's books from 1987 to 1989. The real books, not the ones he shows the IRS. Check the storage unit he rents on Highway 51. Unit 47. He thinks I don't know about it, but I followed him there last week. I tried to act normal at Sunday dinner, but Frank kept watching me. When I asked about his business expansion plans, his eyes went cold. He knows I know. I've hidden this evidence where I hope someone will find it if I can't come forward myself. I wanted to protect Mom, but I realize now that protecting her might mean sacrificing my own safety. I should have called the police weeks ago. Now I'm afraid it's too late. If you're reading this, I pray it means someone cared enough to keep looking for the truth. Patterson set down the final note, his hands trembling slightly. Sarah Beth Morrison hadn't been an innocent victim of random violence. She had been a young woman who stumbled onto a dangerous secret and found herself trapped between family loyalty and moral obligation. She had become a threat to Frank's carefully constructed criminal empire, and threats had a way of disappearing in the world of organized crime. The detective gathered the photographs and notes, securing them in evidence bags. This changed everything about the investigation. Sarah Beth's disappearance wasn't a missing person case. It was murder. But as Patterson prepared to leave the house, one troubling thought nagged at him. If Frank had killed Sarah Beth to protect his secrets, why was his alibi so thoroughly documented? Multiple witnesses, security footage, phone records. Everything pointed to Frank being elsewhere when his stepdaughter vanished. The alibi was perfect. Too perfect. In Patterson's experience, perfect alibis often indicated the most guilty suspects of all. Detective Patterson spread Frank's alibi documentation across his desk at the Illinois State Police Field Office in Springfield. 3 weeks had passed since discovering Sarah Beth's hidden evidence, and the investigation had taken on federal dimensions with the FBI's involvement in the money laundering case. The timeline was maddeningly precise. Sunday, December 10, 1989, the night Sarah Beth disappeared, Frank Kowalski's whereabouts were documented minute by minute. Security footage from the garage showed Frank arriving at 6:30 p.m. to work on a customer's transmission. The timestamp was clear, the image unmistakable. Phone records confirmed calls to auto parts suppliers in Chicago at 7:15 p.m. and 8:45 p.m. 3 different employees had given statements placing Frank at the garage until after 11 p.m. He's either innocent or incredibly thorough, FBI agent Rebecca Morris observed. reviewing the files. Morris had been assigned to the financial crimes investigation and found herself drawn into the missing person case. Patterson studied the security footage again. Something about Frank's demeanor on camera bothered him. The man moved with purpose, but there was a theatrical quality to his actions, too deliberate, too aware of the camera's presence. What if the alibi itself is the crime? Patterson suggested. What if he spent months setting this up? Morris nodded slowly. Create an ironclad alibi for a predetermined night, then execute the plan. But that would require incredible patience and planning. The phone records presented another puzzle. Both calls to Chicago lasted exactly 3 minutes, suggesting brief, business-like conversations rather than extended technical discussions with parts suppliers. Patterson made a note to interview the alleged recipients of those calls, though he suspected they would either support Frank's story or claim no memory of the conversations entirely. Millbrook's Main Street felt different in the months following Sarah Beth's disappearance. The discovery of Frank's criminal connections had split the community along invisible lines that cut through families and friendships. At Morrison's diner, the morning coffee crowd engaged in heated whispered conversations that ended abruptly when certain people entered. Frank's supporters, mostly men whose sons worked at the garage, insisted he was being framed by outsiders who didn't understand small-town loyalty. Frank gave my boy Jimmy a job when nobody else would hire him, declared Earl Watson, whose son had struggled with drinking after high school. That man's done more for this community than most folks who were born here. But other voices grew bolder as federal agents became regular visitors to Millbrook. Margaret Chin openly questioned how she could have trusted her daughter to a man connected to organized crime. How do we know Sarah Beth was his first victim? She asked during a heated PDA meeting. How do we know our children were ever safe around him? The divide extended into families. Linda Morrison found herself increasingly isolated as neighbors struggled to balance their sympathy for her loss with their suspicions about her husband. Some friends stopped visiting entirely, unwilling to risk association with Frank's household. Tom Rodriguez, whose son Miguel had been in Sarah Beth's class, summed up the community's anguish. We don't know who to trust anymore. If Frank could fool us all for so long, who else might be hiding things? Linda Morrison began her own careful examination of the man she had married, though she couldn't admit this even to herself. She told herself she was simply trying to understand how Sarah Beth had become involved in investigating Frank's business. She started with small things, going through Frank's desk drawers while he showered, examining bank statements more carefully than she ever had before. The numbers didn't mean much to her, but she copied them onto index cards and hid them in her jewelry box. Frank's behavior had changed since the investigation began. He came home later, spoke less during dinner, and spent long periods staring out the kitchen window towards Sarah Beth's empty house. When federal agents visited, asking questions about finances and business operations, Frank would retreat to his workshop for hours afterward. "They're trying to destroy everything I've built," he told Linda one evening, his voice carrying an edge she'd never heard before. Sarah Beth got mixed up in something she didn't understand, and now they're using it to come after me. Linda noticed he never actually denied the criminal allegations. He spoke about misunderstandings and persecution, but never about innocence. The physical distance between them grew. Frank stopped reaching for her hand during their evening television watching. He slept restlessly, sometimes rising at 3 a.m. to make phone calls from his workshop. Linda pretended to sleep during these late-night conversations, though she could hear the urgency in his muffled voice. FBI agent Morris presented her findings to Patterson in February 1990, 2 months after Sarah Beth's disappearance. The financial investigation had yielded impressive results, enough evidence to prosecute Frank for money laundering, tax evasion, and conspiracy to commit fraud. "We can put him away for 15 to 20 years on the financial charges," Morris explained. "But we can't connect him to Sarah Beth's disappearance. His alibi is too solid, and we have no physical evidence linking him to her last known location." The irony frustrated both investigators. They had solved one crime while being stymied by another. Frank's criminal enterprise was extensive, washing money for 3 different Chicago crime families, facilitating car theft rings, providing fraudulent documentation for stolen vehicles. His associates are closing ranks, Morris continued. 2 potential witnesses have left Illinois entirely. Another claims he never met Frank, despite photographic evidence to the contrary. Patterson understood the pattern. Criminal organizations survive by protecting their own, at least until cooperation became personally advantageous. Frank's value to his Chicago partners made him worth protecting, even if it meant sacrificing resources to maintain his freedom. What about the storage unit Sarah Beth mentioned in her notes? Empty when we got the warrant. Recently cleaned, no evidence left behind. Frank's thorough, I'll give him that. 3 months after Sarah Beth's disappearance, Linda Morrison was sorting through Frank's winter clothes to donate items he no longer wore. In the pocket of an old work jacket, her fingers found a small metal object. A key. Not a house key or car key, but something smaller. Stamped on the metal were the numbers 412, the same address as Sarah Beth's rental house. Imagine finding evidence that your spouse lied to police about a missing family member. Linda Morrison lived with that knowledge for months before speaking up. If you think you would have the courage to turn in someone you loved, leave a comment below. And subscribe if you want to see how Linda's discovery changes everything. Because what happens next will test every assumption about this case. Linda sat on the bedroom floor, staring at the key in her palm. Frank had denied having access to Sarah Beth's house. He had looked Detective Patterson in the eye and claimed only Sarah Beth and Linda had keys. But here was proof that her husband had lied to police. The question that terrified Linda was simple. Why would Frank need a secret key to his stepdaughter's home? And what had he used it for on the night Sarah Beth disappeared? Detective Mike Patterson cleaned out his desk on a gray March morning in 1992, 27 years of police work reduced to a cardboard box and a retirement plaque. The Sarah Beth Morrison file sat prominently on top of his personal belongings, 3 thick folders that had consumed his thoughts for over 2 years. "You sure you want to take that home?" asked Detective Ray Sullivan, Patterson's replacement on the case. "Might be better to let sleeping dogs lie." Patterson hefted the box, feeling the weight of unsolved questions. "This one's not sleeping. It's just waiting." Sullivan had reviewed the case files twice since his assignment, bringing fresh eyes and modern techniques to the investigation. But 1992 technology offered little advancement over 1989 methods. No DNA databases, no digital forensics, no cell phone tracking. The case remained frozen in time, dependent on witness testimony and physical evidence that Frank Kowalski had been careful not to leave behind. Federal boys closed their financial investigation last year, Sullivan reminded Patterson. Frank took a plea deal, 5 years for money laundering, served 18 months. He's clean now, officially speaking. Patterson paused at the door. Clean men don't usually need 18 months in federal prison to learn their lesson. Over the following years, Sullivan would periodically reopen the Morrison file, hoping new technology or witness cooperation might break the case. Each review yielded the same result, compelling circumstantial evidence, but nothing that would survive a courtroom challenge. By 1995, the Illinois State Police officially reclassified Sarah Beth Morrison as a cold case. Frank Kowalski emerged from federal prison in late 1991 a changed man, outwardly, at least. His 18-month sentence had been served at a minimum security facility in Indiana, more like an extended business retreat than genuine punishment. His criminal associates had maintained their silence, his financial assets remained largely intact, and his abbreviated sentence suggested cooperation with federal investigators. In 1993, Frank sold Kowalski's auto repair to his former assistant manager and relocated to Clearwater, Florida. The buyer, Danny Morrison, no relation to Sarah Beth, paid cash, money that investigators suspected came from Frank's hidden assets, laundered through legitimate business channels. Frank's new life unfolded in the Sunrise Manor retirement community, a sprawling complex of condominiums and shared amenities that catered to Midwestern retirees seeking Florida sunshine. He purchased a modest 2-bedroom unit overlooking the community golf course and settled into a routine of morning walks, afternoon card games, and evening dinner parties with neighbors who knew nothing of his past. To his new friends, Frank was a successful small business owner who had sold his Illinois garage and retired comfortably. He played bridge twice weekly, volunteered at the community food bank, and dated divorced women who found his quiet confidence attractive. Frank's a real gentleman, neighbor Dorothy Henderson told anyone who asked. Helps me with my groceries, drives me to doctor appointments when my son can't. We need more men like him in this world. Frank never mentioned Sarah Beth Morrison. When conversation turned to family, he spoke only of his business success and the foresight to sell before economic downturns affected small-town enterprises. His past existed in carefully constructed stories that revealed nothing while appearing to share everything. Linda Morrison's journey through grief took place 3 states away from Frank's comfortable retirement. Their marriage had ended in divorce proceedings that Frank did not contest, leaving Linda with their modest house and a settlement that covered basic living expenses. The therapy sessions began in 1991 and continued sporadically for years. Dr. Patricia Reeves, a clinical psychologist in Springfield, helped Linda navigate the complex trauma of losing a daughter while suspecting her husband of murder. I wake up every morning wondering if today will bring answers, Linda confided during a session in 1994. Then I go to bed knowing I'm another day further from the truth. Linda hired 3 different private investigators over the years, spending her savings and borrowing against her house to fund continued searches for evidence. Each investigation yielded the same frustrating conclusion. Frank Kowalski was almost certainly responsible for Sarah Beth's disappearance, but proving it remained impossible. The investigators uncovered additional details about Frank's criminal associations, documented his movements during the months following Sarah Beth's disappearance, and even located the Chicago storage unit mentioned in Sarah Beth's final note. But the unit had been cleaned and rented to new tenants within weeks of Sarah Beth's disappearance, its contents lost forever. By 2000, Linda's savings were exhausted and her hope nearly extinguished. She stopped hiring investigators and began the slow process of learning to live with uncertainty. Some questions don't have answers, Dr. Reeves told her during their final regular session. Healing means accepting that truth while refusing to let it define your entire existence. Linda never stopped wondering about her daughter's fate, but she gradually stopped expecting to learn it. Millbrook, Illinois transformed gradually during the 1990s and 2000s, its character shifting as farming families sold their land to developers and Chicago commuters discovered the town's affordable housing and small-town charm. By 2005, Sarah Beth Morrison's former students had grown into adults with children of their own. Emma Chun, now Emma Rodriguez after marrying her high school sweetheart, brought her 6-year-old daughter to Millbrook Elementary for kindergarten registration. I always think about Miss Morrison when I walk these halls, Emma told Principal Janet Williams, who had somehow managed to remain in her position for over 15 years. She made me love learning. I became a teacher because of her. Williams, now in her 60s, nodded sadly. Not a day goes by that I don't wonder what happened to her. She had so much to give the world. New residents knew nothing of Sarah Beth Morrison or Frank Kowalski. The auto repair shop had been converted into a farm equipment dealership, its connection to organized crime forgotten by most. Longtime residents rarely discussed the case, finding it easier to focus on Millbrook's growth and prosperity than dwell on unsolved mysteries. But some memories persisted. Tom Rodriguez, whose son Miguel had struggled with reading until Sarah Beth's intervention, kept a photograph of his 3rd-grade class on his office wall. Sarah Beth stood beside her students, young and radiant, unaware that her life would end before she turned 23. I tell my kids about her sometimes, Tom explained to his wife. How one person can make a difference in a child's life. How we should remember the good people who get taken too soon. The case had become local legend rather than active investigation, referenced in hushed conversations and remembered during holiday gatherings when families shared stories about people who had shaped their lives. 30 years. That's how long Frank Kowalski lived as a free man, while Sarah Beth's family suffered in silence. If this case is making your blood boil like it did mine when I first researched it, smash that like button. And if you want to see justice prevail in cases like this, subscribe and ring that notification bell, because what happens next will restore your faith that the truth always finds a way. On a Tuesday morning in March 2019, Detective Maria Santos of the Illinois State Police Cold Case Unit received a phone call that would resurrect Sarah Beth Morrison's case from 3 decades of dormancy. "This is construction foreman Jake Miller from Millbrook," the voice said. "We're renovating the old Kowalski garage for a new shopping complex. You're going to want to see what we just found buried under the concrete floor." Santos grabbed a pen and notepad, her pulse quickening with the familiar excitement that came with potential breakthroughs in long-dormant cases. "What exactly did you find, Mr. Miller?" "Human remains. And detective, whoever's down here has been dead a very long time." The truth, it seemed, had finally found its way to the surface. Jake Miller had worked construction for 23 years, but he had never encountered anything like what lay beneath the service bay floor of the old Kowalski garage. The renovation project for the new Millbrook shopping plaza had proceeded normally until Tuesday morning, when the crew's jackhammer broke through an unusually thick concrete slab. "Stop the equipment," Miller called to his workers, staring down into the hole they had created. The concrete here was different, newer than the surrounding foundation, poured in a rough rectangle approximately 6 feet by 3 feet. Someone had taken care to make this section appear seamless with the original floor, but closer inspection revealed subtle differences in texture and color. Miguel Rodriguez, Tom's son who now worked construction after his father's encouragement, peered into the opening. "Boss, there's something wrapped in plastic down there." Miller descended into the shallow excavation, his flashlight illuminating what appeared to be fabric and organic material preserved by the concrete's protective barrier. Even after 30 years in construction, he recognized human remains when he saw them. "Everyone off the site," Miller ordered, pulling out his cell phone. "This is now a crime scene." Within 2 hours, the construction area buzzed with law enforcement activity. Detective Maria Santos of the Cold Case Unit arrived from Springfield, accompanied by forensic anthropologist Dr. Jennifer Walsh from the University of Illinois. The Illinois State Police had learned to take potential discoveries seriously, especially when they occurred in locations connected to unsolved cases. "The preservation is remarkable," Dr. Walsh observed, photographing the scene before beginning the delicate extraction process. "Concrete creates an anaerobic environment that can maintain organic material for decades." Santos consulted the case files she had brought from Springfield. Sarah Beth Morrison's disappearance had occurred in December 1989. The construction timeline for the garage's service bay expansion, according to county permits, began in January 1990, just weeks after Sarah Beth vanished. The forensic examination took place at the State Crime Laboratory in Springfield, where technology available in 2019 would have seemed like science fiction to investigators 30 years earlier. Dr. Robert Chun, the lab's chief forensic pathologist, explained the process to Detective Santos as technicians prepared the remains for analysis. "In 1989, we could determine age, sex, and approximate time of death through skeletal examination," Dr. Chun explained. "DNA analysis was theoretical for most police departments. Today, we can extract genetic material from bone fragments that have been buried for decades." The initial examination confirmed the remains belonged to a young woman, approximately 20 to 25 years old, who had been deceased for several decades. Fabric fragments matched the description of clothing Sarah Beth Morrison wore the night she disappeared, a blue sweater and dark jeans. But DNA analysis would provide definitive identification. Technicians extracted genetic material from the femur bone, then compared it to a reference sample provided by Linda Morrison. The process that once required weeks of laboratory work could now be completed in days. Modern STR analysis allows us to create genetic profiles from severely degraded samples, explained Dr. Sarah Kim, the lab's DNA specialist. "We can identify individuals even when traditional forensic markers have deteriorated." The comparison process involved examining 13 core genetic markers, creating a profile unique to the individual. Each marker required statistical analysis to ensure accuracy, building a mathematical certainty that would satisfy legal requirements. The call came to Linda Morrison on a Thursday afternoon in late March 2019. She was working in her garden, planting tulip bulbs that would bloom long after she expected to see them flower, When Detective Santos's call finally provided the answer she had waited 3 decades to receive. Mrs. Morrison, this is Detective Santos from the Illinois State Police. We have confirmed that the remains found at the former Kowalski garage belong to your daughter, Sarah Beth. Linda set down her gardening trowel and closed her eyes. After 30 years of uncertainty, the confirmation brought both relief and renewed grief. Her daughter was dead. She had known this intellectually for years, but now the knowledge carried scientific certainty. "Can I see her?" Linda asked, though she wasn't sure what she meant by the question. "The remains have been released to the coroner for final documentation," Santos replied gently. "You'll be able to make arrangements for burial once our investigation is complete." News of the discovery spread through Millbrook within hours. Emma Rodriguez called her mother with tears in her voice, remembering the third-grade teacher who had encouraged her love of reading. Tom Rodriguez stood in his office, staring at the photograph of Sarah Beth's class, finally understanding that their beloved teacher would never grow old. Principal Janet Williams, now retired but still living in Millbrook, gave a statement to the local newspaper. "Sarah Beth Morrison was taken from us too soon, but her impact on this community will never be forgotten. Today, we finally know where she rested, and we can honor her memory properly." The community's reaction mixed relief with anger. Sarah Beth had been buried beneath their feet for 30 years, while Frank Kowalski lived freely in Florida. The injustice of it settled over Millbrook like a storm cloud, demanding resolution. Dr. Walsh's detailed examination of the remains revealed evidence that transformed the case from murder to something far more complex and disturbing. While conducting the thorough skeletal analysis required for legal proceedings, she discovered smaller bone fragments that suggested Sarah Beth Morrison had not died alone. "Detective Santos, you need to see this," Dr. Walsh said, calling the detective back to the laboratory. Sarah Beth Morrison was pregnant when she died. Approximately 12 to 14 weeks based on fetal development. The revelation hit Santos like a physical blow. A pregnant 22-year-old teacher killed and buried beneath concrete. The crime had layers of tragedy that even experienced investigators found difficult to process. "The fetal remains are well preserved," Dr. Walsh continued. "We should be able to extract DNA from both maternal and fetal tissue." Santos understood the implications immediately. If they could identify the father of Sarah Beth's unborn child, they might finally understand the true motive for her murder. Had Frank Kowalski killed his stepdaughter to protect his criminal enterprise, or had there been an even more personal reason for eliminating the young teacher? "How long will the DNA analysis take?" Santos asked. 2 weeks for preliminary results. The lab will analyze both maternal DNA for final confirmation and fetal DNA for paternal identification. Santos called Linda Morrison again that evening, this time with news that would shatter the older woman's understanding of her daughter's final months. "There's something else we discovered, Mrs. Morrison. Sarah Beth was pregnant when she died." The silence on the phone stretched for nearly a minute before Linda found her voice. "Pregnant? She never. She would have told me. Sarah Beth told me everything." But even as Linda spoke, she realized this wasn't true. Sarah Beth had been hiding her investigation of Frank's criminal activities. What other secrets had she carried in her final weeks? The question that terrified Linda, the question that would keep her awake for the next 2 weeks, was simple. Who was the father of Sarah Beth's unborn child? When the DNA results revealed the answer, everyone connected to the case would understand that Frank Kowalski's crimes extended far beyond money laundering and murder. They would discover that the man Linda Morrison had trusted with her daughter's safety had betrayed that trust in the most unthinkable way imaginable. Dr. Sarah Kim stared at the DNA analysis results for several minutes before picking up the phone to call Detective Santos. In 20 years of forensic work, she had delivered difficult news to investigators, but this case carried a level of horror that made her hesitate. "Detective Santos, this is Dr. Kim at the State Lab. The paternal DNA results are in for the Morrison case." Santos sat at her desk in Springfield, surrounded by case files and evidence boxes that had taken on new significance with each discovery. "What did you find?" The biological father of Sarah Beth Morrison's unborn child was Frank Kowalski. The silence stretched across the phone line as Santos processed the implications. Sarah Beth hadn't just discovered her stepfather's criminal activities. She had been his victim in ways that made her knowledge even more dangerous to him. You're certain about the results? 13 markers, all matching. The probability of paternity is 99.97%. Frank Kowalski was the father of his stepdaughter's child. Santos closed her eyes, understanding finally why Frank had been so desperate to eliminate Sarah Beth. The young teacher hadn't just threatened to expose his money laundering operation. She could have destroyed his entire life with a single accusation. Dr. Kim, I need you to expedite your written report. We're going to need an arrest warrant immediately. The detective's next call went to Linda Morrison, a conversation she dreaded but couldn't avoid. Linda answered on the second ring, her voice already tense with anticipation. Mrs. Morrison, we have the DNA results. I need to tell you something that's going to be very difficult to hear. The revelation transformed every piece of evidence Santos had reviewed over the past month. Frank's carefully constructed alibi, his calm demeanor during the original investigation, his quick departure from Illinois after serving his federal sentence. Everything made sense when viewed through the lens of a man protecting not just criminal activities, but the most damaging secret imaginable. Santos called Agent Rebecca Morris, now retired from the FBI, but still available for consultation on cold cases. Morris had worked the original financial investigation and understood Frank's psychology better than anyone. It explains the timeline, Morris said after Santos briefed her on the DNA results. Sarah Beth discovered Frank's criminal activities in September 1989. If she was 12 to 14 weeks pregnant when she died in December, conception would have occurred in late August or early September. You think she confronted him about the abuse around the same time she started investigating his business? More likely, the pregnancy forced a confrontation. Sarah Beth was a moral young woman, a teacher responsible to her community. Discovering she was carrying her stepfather's child would have created an impossible situation. Santos reviewed Sarah Beth's hidden notes with this new understanding. The young teacher's growing distress in her final entries took on deeper meaning when considered alongside an unwanted pregnancy that represented the ultimate violation of family trust. The final note, Frank knows I found out, might have referred to more than criminal activities. Frank may have suspected Sarah Beth intended to expose both his money laundering operation and their illicit relationship. For a man whose entire life depended on community respect and criminal connections, Sarah Beth Morrison had become an existential threat that required permanent elimination. Armed with DNA evidence and 30 years of accumulated investigation, Santos began reconstructing the night of December 10, 1989, with fresh understanding of Frank's motivation and methods. The security footage from Frank's garage took on new significance when viewed as part of a planned alibi. Frank's theatrical awareness of the camera, his precisely timed phone calls, his documented presence at the garage, all designed to create an unbreakable timeline for the night he planned to kill his stepdaughter. He spent months setting this up, Santos explained to Illinois State Police Captain James Morrison, no relation. Frank knew Sarah Beth's schedule, her habits, her vulnerabilities. He waited for the perfect opportunity. The key Linda had found in Frank's jacket pocket proved his access to Sarah Beth's house. Santos theorized that Frank had confronted Sarah Beth at her home that Sunday evening, possibly after she threatened to expose both his criminal activities and their relationship. Sarah Beth was small, maybe 115 pounds, Santos continued. Frank was a mechanic, strong from years of physical labor. He could have overpowered her easily, then transported her body to the garage during the night. The concrete pour documented in county records from January 1990 provided the final piece of the puzzle. Frank had buried Sarah Beth beneath the garage floor, then covered the evidence with fresh concrete, creating a tomb that preserved both the crime and the secret for 3 decades. Frank Kowalski, now 73 years old, had lived quietly in Clearwater, Florida, for nearly 30 years. But technology that didn't exist during his original crimes now made him vulnerable to detection and arrest. Santos coordinated with Florida law enforcement to locate Frank's current address, employment status, and daily routines. Credit card records, utility bills, and social media activity of neighbors created a digital footprint that would have been impossible to track in 1989. He's living in the Sunrise Manor retirement community under his real name, reported Detective Maria Gonzalez from the Pinellas County Sheriff's Office. Drives a 2015 Honda Civic, plays bridge on Tuesdays and Thursdays, volunteers at the community center. The irony wasn't lost on Santos. A man who had murdered his pregnant stepdaughter now spent his golden years helping other seniors with their groceries and prescription medications. I want to pause here because I know many of you are feeling the same rage and disgust that I felt when I uncovered this part of Sarah Beth's story. If you've made it this far, you're invested in seeing justice served. Hit that subscribe button if you believe predators like Frank deserve to pay for their crimes. And share this video because Sarah Beth's story needs to be heard. The arrest warrant for Frank Kowalski was signed by Judge Patricia Williams on April 15, 2019, charging him with first-degree murder, sexual assault, and tampering with evidence. But coordinating the arrest across state lines required careful planning to ensure Frank didn't learn of the investigation and attempt to flee. "We need to move quickly," Santos told the Florida team. Frank has demonstrated the ability to disappear before. He's had 30 years to prepare escape routes and false identities. Linda Morrison sat in her kitchen in Millbrook, staring at the telephone after ending her conversation with Detective Santos. The woman who had spent 3 decades wondering about her daughter's fate now faced a truth more horrible than any scenario she had imagined. Frank hadn't just killed Sarah Beth to protect his criminal activities. He had been abusing her, creating the pregnancy that ultimately sealed her fate. Linda realized she had shared her home, her bed, and her trust with a man who had violated her daughter in the most fundamental way possible. The betrayal was complete, devastating, and 30 years too late to prevent. As Florida law enforcement prepared for Frank's arrest, one critical question remained. Would they reach him before he realized the investigation had finally identified him as Sarah Beth Morrison's killer? Frank Kowalski had evaded justice for 3 decades through careful planning and patient execution. Now, as the net closed around him, investigators wondered if the man who had fooled an entire community for so long might have one final escape plan waiting. The answer would come at dawn, when police surrounded his retirement condo with warrants, weapons, and 30 years of accumulated evidence that would finally hold Frank Kowalski accountable for his crimes. The Sunrise Manor retirement community in Clearwater, Florida, awakened to its usual peaceful morning routine on August 18, 2020. Residents emerged for their daily walks along manicured pathways, sprinkler systems activated across perfectly maintained lawns, and the community cafe prepared for the breakfast crowd that gathered each morning to discuss weather, grandchildren, and local news. Frank Kowalski, 73 years old and largely indistinguishable from his neighbors, stepped onto his second-floor balcony at 6:30 a.m. with a cup of coffee and the Tampa Bay Times. He had maintained this routine for nearly 3 decades, a quiet existence that bore no resemblance to the violence that had brought him to Florida. Detective Maria Gonzalez watched through binoculars from an unmarked van positioned across the parking lot. Target is on the balcony, appears to be following normal morning routine. At exactly 7 a.m., a coordinated team of 12 officers surrounded Frank's condominium building. Detective Santos had flown in from Illinois to participate in the arrest, carrying with her the warrant that represented 30 years of accumulated evidence and justice long delayed. Frank answered the knock at his door wearing a bathrobe and reading glasses, his appearance that of a harmless elderly man disturbed during his morning routine. But Santos saw something else in his eyes when she identified herself, a flash of recognition that confirmed Frank had been expecting this moment for 3 decades. "Frank Kowalski, you're under arrest for the murder of Sarah Beth Morrison," Santos announced, reading from the warrant. "You have the right to remain silent." Frank's neighbors gathered in hallways and doorways, watching in shock as the man they knew as a helpful retiree was handcuffed and led away. Dorothy Henderson, who had relied on Frank for grocery runs and prescription pickups, stood in her doorway with tears streaming down her face. "There must be some mistake," she called to the officers. "Frank's a good man. He helps everyone in this building." But Frank said nothing as he was escorted to the patrol car, his face displaying the same calm control that had served him well during the original investigation 30 years earlier. Frank's extradition hearing took place in Tampa federal court 3 weeks after his arrest. His attorney, Marcus Webb, a criminal defense lawyer known for representing white-collar criminals, argued that Illinois lacked sufficient evidence to support the charges. "My client is 73 years old and has lived as a law-abiding citizen in Florida for 30 years, Webb told federal magistrate Judge Catherine Rodriguez. The state's case relies on ancient allegations and circumstantial evidence that would never meet contemporary legal standards. The courtroom was packed with media representatives drawn by the story's sensational elements, a decades-old cold case, a respected community member revealed as a killer, the DNA evidence that had finally solved the mystery. CNN, NBC, and local news stations broadcast live coverage of proceedings that transformed Frank from an anonymous retiree into a national symbol of justice delayed. Assistant State Attorney Jennifer Walsh presented Illinois' case with clinical precision. The defendant murdered his 22-year-old stepdaughter to conceal both his criminal activities and the sexual abuse that resulted in her pregnancy. DNA evidence provides scientific certainty of both the victim's identity and the defendant's paternity of her unborn child. Webb's attempts to challenge the DNA evidence proved futile against modern forensic science. The genetic markers were clear, the chain of custody documented, and the statistical probability overwhelming. After 2 days of testimony, Judge Rodriguez approved Frank's extradition to Illinois. The evidence presented demonstrates probable cause that Mr. Kowalski committed the crimes charged in Illinois, Rodriguez ruled. Extradition is hereby granted. Frank's face remained impassive during the ruling, but observant court reporters noted the slight tremor in his hands as he was led back to his holding cell. Back in Springfield, Illinois, Detective Santos presented the breakthrough evidence that had finally cracked Frank's seemingly perfect alibi. Advanced digital analysis of the 1989 security footage revealed subtle inconsistencies that investigators had missed 3 decades earlier. The timestamps on the garage security system were manually adjusted, explained FBI digital forensics expert Dr. Robert Kim during a press conference. Frank recorded his presence at the garage on Sunday afternoon, then used a timer device to replay that footage during the hours when Sarah Beth disappeared. The investigation had also uncovered Frank's network of paid witnesses. Tommy Brennan, the former garage employee who had reported seeing Frank burn documents, finally admitted under oath that Frank had paid him $5,000 to provide false testimony about working late that Sunday night. "Frank told me exactly what to say and when to say it," Brennan testified to a grand jury. He said if anyone asked, "I was supposed to remember seeing him at the garage until after midnight." 2 other witnesses came forward with similar admissions. Frank's supposedly spontaneous phone calls to Chicago parts suppliers had been prearranged, with associates agreeing to confirm receiving the calls at specific times whether Frank actually called or not. The conspiracy had required months of planning and significant financial resources, but it had protected Frank for 3 decades while he lived freely in Florida. News of Frank's arrest rippled through Millbrook like an earthquake, shaking foundations of trust that had taken decades to rebuild after Sarah Beth's disappearance. Residents who had defended Frank's innocence now questioned their own judgment and wondered how thoroughly they had been deceived. Tom Rodriguez, whose son Miguel had been in Sarah Beth's 3rd grade class, struggled with the revelation. "I let my kids around that man," he told his wife. "I shook his hand at church functions. How do you live with knowing you trusted a killer?" Margaret Shun, whose daughter Emma had adored Sarah Beth, found herself reviewing every interaction she'd had with Frank during the 1990s. "He came to Emma's high school graduation party," she remembered, "brought a gift, congratulated her on following in Sarah Beth's footsteps by becoming a teacher. How could he stand there and act normal, knowing what he'd done?" The community's anger extended beyond Frank to the system that had allowed him to escape justice for so long. Some residents organized vigils for Sarah Beth, while others demanded investigations into how Frank's criminal activities had remained hidden from federal authorities who should have connected his money laundering operation to her disappearance. Linda Morrison made the trip to Florida for Frank's extradition hearing, the first time she had seen her former husband in over 20 years. Court security allowed her a brief moment in the hallway as Frank was transferred between hearings. "Look at me," Linda demanded as Frank passed in shackles. For the first time since his arrest, Frank's composure cracked. He stopped walking and met Linda's eyes, perhaps seeing in her face the daughter he had violated and murdered. "Why?" Linda whispered, her voice carrying 30 years of grief and rage. "She trusted you. I trusted you." Frank's mouth opened as if to speak, but no words came. The man who had fooled an entire community for 3 decades found himself speechless when confronted by the mother of his victim. "You stole everything from me," Linda continued. "My daughter, my marriage, my peace. But you didn't win, Frank." The truth found its way out. Frank was led away without responding, leaving Linda with the satisfaction of seeing fear in the eyes of the man who had destroyed her family. As Frank's trial date approached, legal experts debated whether 30-year-old evidence would be sufficient to secure a conviction against a defendant who had demonstrated remarkable skill at avoiding consequences. The DNA evidence was undeniable, but Frank's defense team prepared to challenge every aspect of the investigation. The question that haunted everyone involved in the case was simple: would justice finally be served? Or would Frank Kowalski find one last way to escape accountability for the crimes that had haunted Millbrook for 3 decades? The answer would come in a Springfield courtroom, where 12 jurors would decide whether the evidence was enough to convict a man who had evaded justice for longer than Sarah Beth Morrison had been alive. The Sangamon County Courthouse in Springfield had never hosted a trial that drew such intense public attention. By 7 a.m. on March 15, 2021, crowds lined the courthouse steps despite the March chill, many carrying photographs of Sarah Beth Morrison and signs demanding justice for crimes that had remained hidden for over 3 decades. Inside courtroom 4, every seat was occupied. Emma Rodriguez sat in the front row, now 39 years old and a teacher herself, clutching the hand of Miguel Rodriguez, her former classmate whose reading difficulties Sarah Beth had patiently addressed every Tuesday after school. Tom Rodriguez sat behind them, his hair gray, but his memory crystal clear about the young woman who had changed his son's life. Linda Morrison occupied a seat directly behind the prosecution table, her face bearing the weight of 31 years of grief, but also the quiet strength of a woman who had never stopped believing this day would come. Frank Kowalski entered the courtroom in an Orange County Jail uniform, his hands shackled, his 74-year-old frame diminished by months of incarceration. The confident mechanic who had once commanded respect in Millbrook had been replaced by an elderly man whose carefully constructed facade had finally crumbled. State's Attorney Jennifer Walsh presented the case with methodical precision, walking the jury through DNA evidence, financial records, witness testimony, and the technological advances that had finally exposed Frank's elaborate deception. The defendant spent months planning the perfect crime, Walsh told the 12-person jury. He created an intricate alibi, manipulated security footage, paid witnesses to lie, and buried his victim beneath concrete, where he believed she would never be found. But science and persistence have a way of revealing truth, even after 30 years. Defense attorney Marcus Webb attempted to challenge the DNA evidence and question the reliability of witnesses who had changed their stories after 3 decades. But the genetic markers were irrefutable, the forensic timeline clear, and the motive undeniable. When Frank took the stand in his own defense, his testimony felt like watching a master manipulator stripped of his tools. Gone was the charming mechanic who had fooled an entire community. In his place sat an elderly man whose denials sounded hollow against the weight of scientific evidence. "I never hurt Sarah Beth," Frank insisted, his voice steady, but his eyes avoiding the gallery where Linda Morrison watched every word. "She was like a daughter to me." The irony of his words wasn't lost on anyone in the courtroom. After 4 days of testimony and 6 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict. Foreman Patricia Chun, Emma's mother, who had served on the jury without revealing her connection to the case, stood to address Judge William Morrison. On the charge of first-degree murder in the death of Sarah Beth Morrison, we find the defendant guilty. The courtroom erupted in restrained celebration, 30 years of frustration and grief finding release in that single word, guilty. Linda Morrison closed her eyes and whispered what might have been a prayer or simply her daughter's name. Frank showed no visible reaction to the verdict, his face maintaining the same controlled expression that had served him through decades of deception. 2 weeks later, Judge Morrison delivered the sentence. Mr. Kowalski, you violated the most fundamental trust imaginable. You murdered a young woman who should have been able to depend on your protection. You robbed a community of a beloved teacher, a mother of her only child, and countless students of the guidance Sarah Beth Morrison would have provided throughout their lives. The judge paused, looking directly at Frank. You will spend the remainder of your life in prison without the possibility of parole. Justice has been delayed, but it has not been denied. Frank was led away in shackles. His 3-decade run of freedom finally ended. On a warm Saturday in June 2021, Sarah Beth Morrison was finally laid to rest in Millbrook Cemetery, her gravesite overlooking the elementary school where she had taught with such passion. The funeral drew hundreds of mourners, including former students now in their 40s who brought their own children to honor the teacher who had shaped their lives. Linda Morrison stood beside the casket, holding a photograph of Sarah Beth in her graduation cap and gown, finally able to say goodbye to the daughter she had lost but never stopped loving. She wanted to make a difference, Linda told the gathered crowd. And she did. Look around you. Teachers, parents, community leaders who carry forward the lessons she taught in her brief time with us. Emma Rodriguez placed a handwritten note on the casket from her current 3rd-grade class, 28 children who had never met Sarah Beth Morrison but had learned about her courage and dedication. The note read, "Thank you for showing our teacher how to help us learn." The community began the long process of healing, grappling with how thoroughly they had been deceived and what signs they might have missed. Some residents started a scholarship fund in Sarah Beth's name for young women pursuing education degrees. Others pushed for mandatory reporting training to help identify potential abuse situations. As Frank began serving his life sentence at Menard Correctional Center, investigators continued examining his past for evidence of other crimes. Detective Santos received calls from law enforcement agencies across the Midwest, asking about unsolved cases from the 1980s and 1990s that might be connected to Frank's criminal network. A missing person case from 1987 in neighboring Missouri bore disturbing similarities to Sarah Beth's disappearance. A young woman who had worked at a garage connected to Frank's money laundering operation had vanished without a trace, her body never found. Frank operated in this world for decades, Santos explained to reporters. We may never know the full extent of his crimes or how many victims there might be. Tommy Brennan, the former garage employee who had finally told the truth about Frank's activities, struggled with guilt over his decades of silence. I could have spoken up sooner, he told investigators. Maybe if I had been brave enough to tell the truth in 1989, other people wouldn't have gotten hurt. The Chicago crime families that had used Frank's garage for money laundering had long since moved their operations elsewhere, their connection to Sarah Beth's murder adding another layer of violence to an already bloody criminal enterprise. Sarah Beth Morrison's story reminds us that monsters often hide behind the most ordinary faces, and that justice, though delayed, can still find its way home. If this case has moved you, if it's made you think about the secrets people keep, let me know in the comments below. Subscribe to see more cold cases solved and share this video, because Sarah Beth's memory deserves to live on, and her story might help solve other cases just like it. Until next time, remember, the truth always finds a way. In the end, Sarah Beth Morrison's legacy extended far beyond the tragedy of her death. Her courage in documenting Frank's crimes, even while facing personal danger, provided the evidence that eventually brought him to justice. Her dedication to her students lived on in the teachers she had inspired and the lives she had touched. Modern forensic science had finally given voice to a young woman who had been silenced for 3 decades. Her story served as a reminder that no crime, no matter how carefully planned or thoroughly concealed, remains hidden forever when dedicated investigators refuse to give up the search for truth. The last image of Sarah Beth Morrison shows her surrounded by her third-grade students on Picture Day, 1989. Her bright smile and caring eyes reflect the spirit of a young woman who wanted nothing more than to help children learn and grow. Behind every true crime story is a real person whose life was cut short, whose dreams were stolen, whose potential was never fully realized. Sarah Beth Morrison was 22 years old when she died. She should have had a lifetime of students to teach, children of her own to raise, and decades of contributions to make to her community. Instead, she became a symbol of justice delayed but not denied, a reminder that the truth always finds its way to the surface, and a testament to the power of never giving up the fight for accountability. Sarah Beth Morrison's story reminds us that monsters often hide behind the most ordinary faces, and that justice, though delayed, can still find its way home. If this case has moved you, if it's made you think about the secrets people keep, let me know in the comments below. Subscribe to see more cold cases solved and share this video, because Sarah Beth's memory deserves to live on, and her story might help solve other cases just like it. Until next time, remember, the truth always finds a way. Her memory lives on in every classroom where teachers inspire young minds, in every investigation where evidence finally reveals long-hidden truths, and in every community that refuses to let the innocent be forgotten.